Hey Star Trek fans, Dan Gunther here, back with the penultimate episode of the Picard Deep Dive. That's right, there's just 2 episodes left, counting this one. It's been a long road getting from there to here, as someone famous once said. But yeah, we're closing in on the final episode of Picard. In this episode, of course, I have the Easter eggs and canon connections that I was able to find in this episode, Vox, Season 3, Episode 9. And what an episode it is, packed with Easter eggs. I'm wearing my Enterprise D t-shirt in honor of course, something big that happens in this episode. But with that said, I should say spoilers abound in this episode. If you've not seen the episode of Star Trek Picard, make sure to do that before watching this. And with that, let's get right down to the Easter eggs that I found in Vox. Obviously, there are many Easter eggs to get to in this week's episode, but before we get to the Galaxy-class elephant in the room, we do have some other Easter eggs and answers to questions that we've had in previous episodes. To start out with, we have Deanna Troi and Jack journeying through his mind, set to the music "I Can't Stop Crying" by Will Grove White. This is continuing the trend this season of having popular music derived apparently from the mixtape that Jean-Luc made for Beverly Crusher during their relationship decades ago. We of course learn in this episode that it is in fact the Borg that is behind Jack's mysterious abilities and the things that he's been going through that have been mistaken for Irumodic syndrome. While I can appreciate that there are some out there who feel that the Borg are an overused concept, I do like the fact that the Borg are coming into the endgame here, given that they have been such a huge part of Jean-Luc Picard's life. It makes sense for this series to end with them being kind of the big bad here. It's also a revelation that makes sense given a lot of what we've seen throughout this season, and in fact Jack talking about connection and perfection really fits in with what we know about the Borg. When the fact of the Borg's involvement is revealed to Jean-Luc Picard, we get some audio from the best of both worlds, with Locutus of Borg's ominous greeting playing over the scene. Beverly Crusher mentions that no one has seen or heard from the Borg in over a decade. I've seen some pushback to this online given that the Borg were a part of last season's story. However, I think the shorthand here is that she's referring to the Borg Collective as opposed to the small splinter group led by Agnes Jurati. When Jack leaves the Titan in a shuttlecraft, Beverly says, "I gave Wesley space, and I lost him to it." This is of course referring to her first son, Wesley Crusher, who left Starfleet Academy to become a traveler, traversing space and time and going on crazy adventures. We see him show up in season 2 of Picard, but he is definitely no longer a part of Beverly Crusher's life. We also learn that the Borg introduced genetic code into Jean-Luc Picard, and we see here another reference to the closing credits, with this being hinted at since episode 1. Another tie to the closing credits is the revelation that while Locutus of Borg was a receiver, Jack himself is actually a transmitter, illustrated by this graphic, which has also been in the closing credits of this season. This revelation also explains something from Star Trek First Contact way back in 1996, when Picard could still hear the voice of the Collective during their attack on Earth in that film. I love that the writers of this show have brought that continuity in and explained that a bit. However, I do have questions. In this episode, Deanna reacts to the revelation that Jack is hearing the Borg or is a transmitter for the Borg by saying that there are protocols and she must warn people and enact these protocols, consider him dangerous. However, in First Contact, Picard informed Deanna that he could hear the Collective. Where were those protocols then, Deanna? All kidding aside, though, I really do love that they've tied in that little bit of continuity. All right, so here we are. It's finally Frontier Day, and we get the entirety, apparently, of Starfleet on display here. Now, there are a ton of Federation starships. I'm going to start with many that we see in the graphics. We have the Ganymede, the Callisto, the Venture, Akira, Huygens, Sutherland, Gilgamesh, Appalachia, Reliant, Thunderchild, Gagarin, Clark, Helios, Zheng He, Shackleton, Luna, Excelsior, Resnick, Firesword, Oberon, and Intrepid. A few of these are ships we have heard of or seen before, even previously this season or last. We also have several starships who are named after people from Star Trek history. The USS John Kelly is named after the astronaut who traveled to Mars, seen in the Voyager episode One Small Step. The USS Forrest would seem to be named after Admiral Forrest from Star Trek Enterprise. We hear in radio chatter the USS Pulaski, named after Catherine Pulaski, the Chief Medical Officer of the Enterprise D in Season 2 of The Next Generation. The USS Ross, presumably named after Admiral William Ross from the Dominion War in Deep Space Nine. The USS Cochrane, of course named after Zefram Cochrane, the inventor of warp drive. The USS Hikaru Sulu, named after, of course, the original series character who became captain in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. And we also have a number of starships named after real-life behind-the-scenes people. The USS Drexler, named after Doug Drexler, designer of the NX-01, member of the art department on various Star Trek television shows. The USS Okuda, named after Michael and or Denise Okuda, who are production designers and artists on Star Trek The Next Generation and beyond. The USS Taranjo, named after the designer of the Luna-class starship, the USS Titan, which was first seen in canon in Star Trek Lower Decks, and the USS Trumbull, named after Douglas Trumbull, which we mentioned in an earlier deep dive. This ship also showed up in the episode The Bounty. Taking part in the Frontier Day festivities is also the newest iteration of the Enterprise lineage, the USS Enterprise F, which is apparently being decommissioned as part of the ceremony. This ship was originally designed for the video game Star Trek Online, and its appearance here marks the first time that we see this starship live in action in canon. Commanding the Enterprise for Frontier Day is Fleet Admiral Shelby, getting the first name of Elizabeth here for the first time in canon. She had been called Elizabeth Shelby in non-canon novels prior to this. The name Elizabeth, of course, comes from the actor who plays Shelby, Elizabeth Dennehy. Shelby was first seen as a lieutenant commander in the TNG Season 3 finale episode, The Best of Both Worlds Part 1. We learn through Shelby's speech that Frontier Day is celebrating the 250th anniversary of the launch of the NX-01, which, as she says, would lead to the creation of what we now know today as Starfleet. Now, in Enterprise, Starfleet did exist prior to the launch of the NX-01, but it's possible here she's referring to the Starfleet that is a branch of the Federation, rather than just the Earth-based organization that it was during the time of Enterprise. Jack Crusher arrives at the location of the Borg ship or complex, whatever this is here, and we hear the mellifluous tones of the Borg Queen, very clearly being voiced by Alice Krieg, reprising her role from Star Trek First Contact. She also appeared in the Voyager finale Endgame as the Borg Queen. She also did voice the character in the Lower Decks episode I Excretus, but hearing her voice here in live action, even though we don't get to see her face, was a very welcome treat. We get an acknowledgement here that the name of Locutus was based on the Latin for the one who speaks. Locutus of Borg was, of course, the designation given to Picard by the Borg Collective. The Borg Queen goes through a couple of different names to give to Jack: Regenerati, meaning rebirth, or Puer Dei, which means child of God. She ultimately settles on Vox, Latin for the voice. We learn that the changelings in the Borg have made alterations to the transporter, essentially using it to assimilate the entirety of Starfleet, or at least members of Starfleet whose brains are still malleable enough, which in humans is below the age of 24, and in other species maybe at different ages. This fits in with a number of clues we've gotten over the course of the season, most notable of which was the episode Imposters, where we see Jack looking at people beaming over from the Titan to the Intrepid and seeing these kind of weird tendrils in his mind's eye, referencing the connections that the Borg are making here. I love, again, that there's all these little hints and clues that ultimately do pay off in a very satisfying way here. Via radio chatter, we learn that the crew of the USS Excelsior has taken control of their bridge. However, due to the fact that all of the starships are interlinked, control of the ship is wrested from them, and the ship is basically put in front of a firing line of starships and destroyed. Now, this Excelsior is not the original Excelsior that we saw during the TOS films, but is in fact the Excelsior II class ship that we saw last season. Now, distressingly, the last time we saw the character of Elnor, he was aboard that ship. However, thankfully, the showrunner, Terry Matalas, has revealed that Elnor was not aboard that ship when it was destroyed. This episode sees the loss of what has become one of my favorite characters in Star Trek recently, and that, of course, is Captain Liam Shaw. He is apparently killed here by his Borg crew members, and we get this scene in one way. It's very satisfying that he calls his first officer 7 of 9, the name that she prefers. I did appreciate that. However, one line that he says makes me really sad when he says, "It's not my ship anymore." And in that way, he's turning over command to 7, but I felt there was a deeper meaning to this line. Over the course of the last few episodes, we've seen him kind of being supplanted by the old guard, Picard, Riker, and the others, and really kind of relegated to being an afterthought on his own ship. And when he said that line, "It's not my ship anymore," I felt really bad for him, and I really feel that this character has gotten short shrift over the last few episodes, and I'm really sad to see him go out this way. So here's hoping somehow they can bring this character back. I don't know how, but I would love to see it. Now, a few episodes ago, Alondra LaForge mentioned the possibility of using something in Bay 12 at the Fleet Museum, and we finally get to see what is being held in Bay 12, and it is, of course, the rebuilt USS Enterprise NCC 1701D. As Geordi mentions, the saucer section was recovered from the surface of Viridian 3 in order to comply with the Prime Directive, so that the inhabitants of Viridian 4 would not discover it at some future date. The remainder of the ship was built out of spare parts from the USS Syracuse, the engine and the nacelles, and presumably the entire secondary hull. It is very, very satisfying to see this ship once again on screen. This vessel played such a huge role in my childhood watching Star Trek The Next Generation. It really did cause me to be choked up a little bit to see it here. So kudos to the creators of the show for bringing it to life this way. Geordi mentions that they, of course, cannot use the Enterprise E, at which point everybody glances up at Worf, and he says, "That was not my fault." This would seem to be further evidence that Worf was in fact the captain of the Enterprise E following Jean-Luc Picard's promotion to Admiral. Now, I'm really curious as to what exactly happened to the Enterprise E. We've learned from sources outside of the show that it was involved in something called the Monfette incident, named after one of the writers on the show, Christopher Monfette, but what exactly occurred there, we don't know. So possibly that will be a story that we get in some future comic or novel. The old Enterprise command crew steps onto the bridge of the Enterprise D, and we see that Geordi has faithfully recreated it as it appeared during the run of Star Trek The Next Generation towards the end of that series. This bridge, of course, went through a number of changes during its lifetime, most notable of which was the addition of new stations and other additions for Star Trek Generations. This version of the bridge would seem to be what we see in the TV series, though, before that refit. So Geordi has restored it to how it was during, season 6 and 7 of TNG, basically. I don't see this as a continuity issue. He clearly used whatever parts were available, and it's the version of the bridge that we would most be familiar with that got the most screen time. So I appreciate it looking like this, and we also seem to have discovered where all the light bulbs from the Titan went, as the lighting on this bridge is much brighter and much more in line with what we saw on TNG than in Generations, or of course, than the bridge of the Titan in this season of Picard. I love Picard calling out that the thing he missed most was the carpet. This was so much fun to see after a lot of the complaints I've seen online of people missing carpet and wanting carpet over the glossy, hard floors of the Titan. The fact that the writers sat on this joke for this long and had to see those comments knowing that this was coming, chef's kiss. I love that. That's beautiful. And probably the part of this whole scene that meant the most to me was hearing Majel Barrett's voice as the ship's computer turning command over to Captain Jean-Luc Picard. Picard accepts the temporary demotion. It was so great to hear Majel Barrett's voice as the computer. I know the audio was lifted from, I believe, the episode Chain of Command Part 1, but it was still wonderful to hear that voice and that old computer sound. So perfect. As Picard takes command of the Enterprise D's bridge, we see he's falling into familiar patterns. First of all, he issues the order, "Make it so." He initiates a Picard maneuver, tugging on his jacket as he takes the command chair, and finally gives the order to engage. And with that, the Enterprise D warps off to whatever fate awaits her in the Sol system with the finale of Star Trek Picard, The Last Generation. Well, those were all of the Easter eggs and canon connections that I was able to find. Were there any that I missed? Please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. All that's left, of course, is to thank you so much for watching and to thank the Patreon supporters of the channel. I truly do appreciate it. You really do make these videos possible. And with that, we have only one episode left, Season 3, Episode 10, the finale, not only of Season 3, but of Star Trek Picard as a whole. The episode is titled The Last Generation, and I cannot wait to watch it and share with you all of the Easter eggs from this final chapter of this amazing 3 seasons of television. Thank you all again so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, as always, live long and prosper.